Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to hit like and subscribe so the algorithm can be found by others. Today we're joined by no other than Burke Brown. Burke, welcome.
Hey Ben, what's up, man? How you doing?
Good to have you again. So today I want to talk about in the roadmaps to resilience, I think a really poignant topic of our times that a lot of people struggle to get their sort of mind around, their experience around, which is really corporate bullies and psychopaths. And it'd be surprising to people how many psychopaths have really entered the corporate mainframe, if you will. And there's a great quote by Abraham Lincoln that said, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And I can tell you in modern day corporate America, that test is going on every day as people get more successful and they rise in the ranks and they have more influence. The idea of humility or the tactics that are employed are real to a lot of people. So what I want to point out to the audience is there's an absolute link between bullying and corporate psychopaths. And that sounds like a strong word, but these psychopaths can really come across as charming, well-dressed. When you first meet them, they seem friendly. They seem like you could work with them. But over time, you start to see that dynamic change. And as we think about what is bullying behavior, it's regular and repeated criticizing, ignoring, humiliating, belittling, undermining, over-supervising, over-managing, intimidating, and ridiculing a person at work. And this happens actually with supervisors. In fact, there's a study I read that the prevalence of corporate bullying via psychopaths is 30 to 40% of all people experience bullying or have experienced the culture of bullying. So, Burke, in your experience, I know you do a lot of corporate work, a lot of development. What have you seen in the regard of management techniques and sort of those dynamics within corporations?
Yeah, man, it's interesting. Obviously, psychopath is not, the definition of a psychopath is so much more intense. So just so people are aware, when we're saying psychopaths, it's like that person that is just pushing you to your limit. Like they have no conscience, almost a sociopath to a certain extent. They have no understanding of what their employees are feeling, the stress, the pressure. All that they care about is their world. It's this egocentric perspective where all they care about is their climb and what they need to do to achieve their ends, their goals. So this is a manager, this is a leader that is not truly a leader, but a person who's just put in a role and is also living out that or displaying the behaviors of that role improperly. So what's really difficult is when you don't have the mindset of a leader and you have the mindset of winning, your metric system will determine how you act. It will determine how you respond or react in situations. If your metric system is climbing the corporate ladder, then your people aren't as important. If your metric system is to create a culture that builds the business so the business can make an impact in the world, then all of a sudden your people become important. So by what you define your success is what will define how you act, right? They say where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So whatever you consider to be a treasure will determine how you act. One of the most important things to do is to understand that leadership roles, to not be a psychopath, right? To not be at that level where you're harming the people, where you're not pushing on people, where you're not micromanaging them, where you're making them, instead of feeling insecure, you're making them feel better. It kind of ties back to something that we were talking about last week. We were talking about Lao Tzu. And I just want to mention this amazing proverb from the Tao Te Ching. And it says, "Why is the sea king of 1,000 streams? Because it lies beneath him." If the leader is to lead his people, he must serve from behind, right? Because he does not compete, he does not meet competition. This is the goal of what we're trying to create. But if you actually look at that and invert it, that's what a lot of people are experiencing in the corporate world, right? It's not that the sea that lies beneath them is the king, it's the mountain that's above them that's the king, right? And it's not the leader who is serving from behind, but it's the one who's standing in the front to be seen. Right? And because he does compete, he needs competition. He sees all things as competition. If even the people that are under him or her are rising up, that becomes a threat. And so the job is, how do I destroy that threat? It's an inverted process or perspective that we have of what leadership is. And by default, the definition of leadership in our society almost increases the likelihood of people taking advantage of the people that are underneath them and taking advantage of the system to maneuver their way politically to the top. So it's a really tough game to play if you don't look at it holistically. If you as a leader don't see how to add value to your employees, but instead add value to yourself, it's going to be a toxic environment. That's just the way it is.
No, it is. And, I use the word, maybe not even sparingly, the idea of sociopath and psychopath, because what corporations, I think, struggle with and what they don't really fully appreciate is with that kind of behavior, the impact, the wave over the people that work at a given organization is very real. We get negative emotions such as stress, anger,
Right.
humiliation, depression, fear, isolation, self-doubt in your own career. You certainly have the concept of ruined careers, right?
Right.
You're resourceful. You become hesitant, right? The confidence isn't there to make the tough choices. You're worried about what your boss is going to say, or if he or she will humiliate you at some level. And ultimately, you become ineffective, I would argue, in those kinds of environments. And I would also say that not only are you impacted from a career standpoint, but it really disrupts your life. It's stalled careers, right? Job switching, unemployment. I mean, I've seen people lose their confidence to the degree that they have really
Right.
not the ability to go get the next job because they've just been decimated by these sort of sociopathic bullies, if you will, in corporate America. And I'd also
Mhm.
argue that corporations really struggle with what to do with that. I read about an organization where the person that was being bullied, they had to sign a contract, and the stipulation was you couldn't talk about it. It was
Mm.
sort of pushed under the rug, and I think they really struggle with this sort of dynamic and this approach.
Right. Right. It's dangerous, man. And I think people really need to take it seriously because bullying is it can create like post-traumatic stress syndrome. You know what I mean? Like this is a real thing. When you're experiencing, you have to understand how many hours you spend at work. You spend so much time at work. So if you wake up being fearful of going to work because of all of the experiences that you could have, if there's any type of bullying or harassment or expectations that are not realistic. And I've had clients who literally feel sick to their stomachs before they go to work, right? And when you're at that place, what does that do to your body? All of a sudden, this is a natural, even though it's just work, the same factors of stress, your sympathetic nervous system is on fire. You wake up and you know that you have to go to work and you know you're going to have to endure A, B, C, and D. You know you have this expectation that can't be met, that's been placed upon you unfairly, right? And at the same time, there's one person that just doesn't like you and talks about you amongst the rest of the group. Either one of those or all of those you're aware of. What's going to happen to your body? Your cortisol levels are going to shoot through the roof, right? Your stress hormones are going to be through your whole body. You're going to get higher blood pressure. It's going to put you in this place of hypertension. It's going to put you in a place where you can't think as well because when you're in fight or flight, you're in the back of your brain. You're not using your frontal cortex. So you won't be able to be as efficient, as clear, as rational, which will only exacerbate the situation. So what happens is by having this much stress, this experience of toxicity, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that you cannot perform the way that you're supposed to. Now, on my side, the work that I do with my clients is I'm like, find out who you are, what your values are, what your boundaries are, what you accept and what you will not accept, and then find another job, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to find a place that ties with your values. If not, if your values go this way and your job goes even slightly this way, that causes discord, and that discord causes stress. And you times that over how many hours a day, how many hours per week, right? Over years, the effect on that is astronomical on your body. And that's why it's so important to be able to kind of, notice what are the red flags when you're experiencing this, and how do you know when it's not you and it's actually the environment that you're in.
No, 100%. I've had people I've worked with that were Machiavellian to the core. Their main job was to create so much disruption in the organization so as not let the organization see what they were doing on the side.
Mm-hmm.
And really it was all for their benefit, for their gain, but it was so disruptive and destructive to the organization. And I
Right.
think, again, the thing I point out to people is that when you're in this kind of environment, your confidence and motivation goes to a bottom basement low. Whereas leadership should be taking you to a penthouse high, you're really at a very low state. Like you said, you got cortisol levels just rocketing through your body. You're,
Right.
you're, you're full of stress and anxiety, right? You can feel it in your stomach. You can feel it in your head. You get migraines, headaches, whatnot.
Right.
And I would argue that it also creates a fight or flight response, right? Flight in the sense of I withdraw my effort, my commitment,
Totally.
my labor, or I fight, meaning I'm counterproductive. I sabotage work projects. I do things surreptitiously, if that's the right word, or whatever that word is I'm trying to say. But you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or it results in further conflict and low job satisfaction, employee turnover, and productivity is just shot to hell. And so I
Right.
think it's really real. And I think part of what I'm trying to do in this dialogue is just get people to wake up and be aware, because sometimes these guys are so artful, these psychopaths, that they make it seem like it's really you are the problem. You're the issue. and they're just creating this sort of dynamic of subterfuge and
Right.
sort of gaslighting, if you will.
Right.
And the people kind of walk back saying, is it me? Am I missing something? Am I coming off the wrong way?
Yeah. You know, the best way to kind of pick up if it's your boss or your manager, it's because we have to be very aware. And I tell this to my clients and everybody that I'm working with when I'm working in organizations. I say the first thing you have to do is you have to see where it's you. Where is it you? For example, you know, we mentioned this before when we were talking about if people have an argument. If I'm 10% wrong and the person's 90% wrong, everything in me wants to fight about the 90% because it's unfair. I only did 10%, they did 90%. We need to spend most of our energy and effort on them. But the problem is you can't control people, right? That 90% that is them is out of your control. So if it's out of your control, why do you try to make it your control and work on trying to fix that 90% or get that person to realize they're wrong? No, the first thing you do is I say, I am in control of that 10%. Since I'm in control of this 10%, I'm going to take time to work on myself. And so before we all of a sudden say, that's my boss, or that's my manager, or that's my CEO or founder or coworker, before we go to the finger pointing, before we go to that place, the first thing we have to do is we have to say, where am I a part of the problem? What are my issues? Am I coming to work late? Am I not performing? Is there something that maybe is not tying to my values? Maybe it's me that's causing this person to react or respond this way. Where am I the locus of control? And so the first thing to do is to find out, okay, I have looked through myself. I've done the research. My values of this place, the reason that I got hired here, the reason that I wanted to work here is still in alignment. I like this person, this person, this person. So I've noticed that it is specifically my experiences with this person or this department that is causing me the most friction. Once you've been able to rationalize, okay, the issue at this point is not me being in a wrong place, but a wrong person who's affecting me negatively, then we can start to see what are the symptoms. How do I know that it's a bad boss, right? How do I know that it's a manager that I can't trust or that I don't like? And there's kind of some key indicators that I've seen in my work is, you know, it starts off with just kind of not having a really clear vision. If you talk to a manager or an executive or a leader in any way, shape, or form, if they have not defined to you specifically what their goals are, right? What their rocks are, what are the things that we want to have done this year, this month, what expectations and roles you have, if those are not clearly defined, it either is a bad boss who's not good at being a boss or a bad boss who's trying to keep things murky so that they can blame you when necessary, right? When you don't have clarity of what your role is or what your expectations are or what days something will get done, when it's kind of offhandedly remarked versus sent in an email and organized, this person doesn't have a clear vision or a clear explanation of what their vision is. And so it makes it easy for you to make mistakes, which makes it easy for them to slip out of the way. This is one thing to kind of be able to be aware of. Another thing is if they reward people who have similar characteristics as them. That's when it kind of becomes a good old boys club. It becomes, okay, you're a seller and you're treating people awfully, but since you're making money, I made money, that's how I got to this level. And they start to work together and they start to reward bad behavior. It's not necessarily bad behavior. They're rewarding a specific metric. Let's say it's sales, but they ignore the bad behavior, which means that they're stamping off on it. So if you start to notice a culture where there's a proliferation of this type of characteristic, then you know that this is a bad seed that's expanding it, that's allowing it to seep through the entire culture. And that's when you want to hit the ejector seat. So these are kind of some of the things to be aware of when you're trying to find out, am I dealing with a truly bad boss or do we just have different characteristics?
That's an excellent point, Burke. And I think that, you know, going back to that sort of personality type, the sociopath, the psychopath, you know, if you're in that environment and you're trying to deal with it, and first you got to acknowledge, sort of like in a 12-step program, that you have a problem and where does the problem really lie? That's kind of important. But I think what happens is sort of subconsciously employees will seek revenge. So again, I think from a corporate standpoint, the CEO could be the most magnanimous guy, the best guy, the well-intentioned guy, but it's the lower level management that could be really Machiavellian. Why? Because they're trying to promote themselves. They're trying to move up in that organization, right? So I think there's that dynamic tension that occurs because there's politics. And you may have appointed this guy in a key position, but that very guy you've appointed is creating so much disruption in the organization. It's really unbelievable. And I also think there's an ethical and moral component of the organization that's diminished within the organization at all levels. When they see this kind of behavior, this kind of activity, it really is disheartening to the people that are honest, intentional, and really trying to do the right thing. And of course, then you get this whole dynamic of, you know, the fix is in, right? This is the kind of people they promote. This is the real message you're sending, despite all the corporate slogans. Besides what they're trying to tell you, it's very real. I remember I worked with a gentleman who was all Machiavellian all the time, was very much a sociopath bully, no question about it. And I saw
Right.
how he permeated that organization, and not the body shame, but he was morbidly overweight. And what was interesting is when people get up to talk in the organization and give a presentation, right? Normally when people give presentations, you let them speak, you let them give the presentation. This guy would routinely cut in, interject, undermine, undercut. And when you think about it and you look at his visage, you say, well, there's no question why he's doing that, right? He lacks control.
Right.
He lacks self-control, right? And this isn't to get people uncomfortable, but you can look at the nonverbal communication. You can look at how one's lived his life or her life, and you can sort of pull a lot of information out of that. And I can tell you this person came in and wrecked it, unequivocally wrecked it. Now, here's what was funny. When that sort of project was done and this person was out of the organization, he would come back to people as if they were best friends. I mean, he was so out of touch with how people really saw him. And so it's a fascinating sort of case study, if you will, in the psychology of these kinds of people, because they're remorseless. They're sort of out of touch with the current of emotion, how people are really experiencing that person, and the incredible damage they can do in terms of, I want to get ahead or advance my career or get in with a certain group is palpable and extreme.
It really is, and it's interesting because, there is a psychology to it in a big way. When we have a vortex, this vacuum that desires for a certain thing, at the end of the day, it's love. It's acceptance. It's non-judgment. It's to be a part. When we don't achieve that, and this is what makes power so dangerous, is that when you gain power with that void, you become that problem. Hurt people hurt people. It ties to what I've experienced with my clients. When I was first a trainer, my goal was to get people in shape, to get them the results that they wanted. Now, that sounds like a good thing. So if I'm successful, I'm successful. But the thing is that if a person comes in with a deep insecurity, let's say they broke up with their girlfriend or their boyfriend cheated on them or something like that, they come in, and I've had it where a client's like, my girlfriend cheated on me and I want a six-pack. And I'm like, why? Obviously, so they can womanize, right? So they can get back at their girlfriend, right? So they can fill that void. So what happens is if I give them the power, the physicality, the aesthetic that they desire, then all of a sudden they run rampant and they live out this need to fill this void, but the void only gets bigger. So I realized that to give someone the power of the aesthetic is dangerous. And so what you have to do is you have to give them the power of aesthetic, but first you have to give them the power of their mind and the power of their purpose and the power of their values and their vision in the world. Because once they have that, then they can use the aesthetic and the purpose and power to make an impact. When you have these environments and corporations, nobody's thinking about mindset. That's the problem. That's why my work is so important, to come in and change the focal point of the organization. Because when you're putting profits over people, you slowly will lose people. I mean, it's just the natural order of things. So what happens is when you are saying, okay, my void is filled by making more money. My void is filled by being able to exert power because I can't exert it in my house. My void is being filled by being seen as such and such because I don't see myself as such and such. Then obviously you're going to create a toxic environment, or you will leech on to other people that are creating that toxic environment, and that will create the culture. You just give it time. The great quote, it says that culture eats strategy for lunch. And what it ultimately means is that at the end of the day, no matter how much strategy you have as an organization, no matter how much money, you could be a unicorn company, but if you do not have clarity, if you do not have a culture that is focused on a very chosen and consciously chosen purpose, then it will fall apart. And I've seen it with companies, man. I've seen it with large companies. I mean, very, very large companies where I'm sitting and I'm listening to the culture. I'm listening, no matter how many billions of dollars it's worth, I'm just sitting there. And I'm like, this thing is bound to fall. And it did. And it has in a huge way. And this is a very large company. And they got so caught up on how much locomotion, how much movement they were making towards the goal. They didn't know what was falling off the back. They didn't know how they were making. They had a separation. I'm not going to name the company, but they had a separation between employees and contractors. And it was almost like a clear segregation between the two groups. They couldn't get invited to the parties right? And so when you have this mindset, yes, it saves you money, but what happens is you start to have the in talking. And what starts to happen is you start to get people to become bitter, as you say. And then the stories and then the narratives start to build and build and build. And all you need is one pop. And at that point, those who were attached to the business are completely disenfranchised and they'll do anything to bring it down, right? This
100%.
is what happens when you don't take care of your people. This is what happens when you don't lift up those that are quote unquote hierarchically under you, right? If you
And this
have
is what
that
happens when organizations don't promote the right people,
right,
with the right philosophy, with the right values, right? So you mentioned earlier, and I was thinking about what are bullies, right? They enjoy hurting other people,
right,
honestly. I mean, just cut to the chase, right? They're cruel, they're selfish, they're parasitic at some levels, or Machiavellian, they're again psychopathic at some levels, or callous, abusive, lacking in empathy. There's a number of adjectives we could use to describe these people. And the reality is there are actual corporate psychopaths. So about 1% of the population are made up of psychopaths. And a population of 330 million, that's what, 3,300,000 roughly, right? And that does include all the kids. So I guess in an adult sense, it's a little less than that. But
right.
You get the picture.
It was a good amount.
but they rather go into corporate positions rather than criminal. Why? Because they realize at a young age, when I come from a better socioeconomic environment, education, family with means, it's much easier to get into power in a corporate sense than to start a career in as a criminal. It's a criminal career, right? And so we know with sociopaths, they have no conscience. There is nothing that inhibits them or their behavior. This is why, in my experience with these people, you can try to reason with them. And the Bible talks about this, right? Reasoning with one another.
Right.
You could talk about a standard of fairness, which everybody relates to. If the standard of fairness is disrupted in an organization, that's when you get a lot of turbulence. You can talk all these concepts to these people, and being as persuasive as they are, because they're charming, they'll smile and they'll listen and act as if they understand, but they're unfeeling. It's almost like they're not there, because that's not the sort of mode of operation for these people. They don't think at the same level we do. So people like you can go in there with the right intention, I would argue, and provide an incredible high impactful program. But unless the CEO of that company sees the dry rot, the cancer that's within the organization from a leadership standpoint, all your good intention, all your great work within that organization, I would argue ultimately won't take full root. I mean, it'll go somewhere in the organization, but not make the impact it otherwise could have.
Right. It's so true. This is why buy-in from the C-suite is so important. I mean, when I do any of my work, I go to the top and I say, if you're not bought in, and I'm not saying bought in as in signing off, signing the check, checking it off. I'm saying bought in internally. If you're not bought in, this will not go beyond. There is no way, and I've had it where a founder or a CEO would be like, make them do this. And I'm like, make them do what? The reason they're doing this is because you're not doing something, right? You have to start at the top. You have to understand that a bad apple can spoil the bunch. You have to understand that if it's unchecked, it will become the culture. It is cancerous, right? And so there has to be, there's a great book called Traction. And one of the things it says is you have to have the right butt in the right seat, right? And so what happens is you have to make sure that I don't care how skilled or talented you are, just because you're good at this, I should put you here. No, because if I move you up, that gives you access to more people, and maybe that'll mess up these people. So it's not always this upward moving trend. It's finding the right person for the right job that'll affect the other people that are doing it right. Because if you have the wrong person in the right seat, no good. If you have the right person in the wrong seat, no good. You have to make sure that you're clear on what you're trying to do, what your roles are, what's allowed and not allowed, what the culture is and is not, and then have that sign off from the top, because then it can matriculate down. The leader is the one who determines the culture. And we've seen that. We've seen what happens. I mean, Uber is an example of that. We've seen what happens.
Right.
So it's important that we make sure that we engage the leadership to say, hey, are you willing to lose profits in the short term to gain them in the long term? Are you willing to excise the cancer so that you can live and be productive in the future, right? Are you willing to lose your, 90% employee so that your 60% can become 80%? You have to have a vision, you have to have a clarity of mind to understand and be willing to do that.
As I've experienced these sociopath sort of bullies in corporate, I'll take it back to a small startup that raised a ton of money. And I would argue these are people that can be totally ruthless by day and sleep perfectly sound as a baby at night. Nothing seems to bother them at all. So there's this guy that I came across that I was talking to raised about $80 million in a startup. And of course, he had that famous Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that sort of set off kind of his aura and his countenance. But he had a huge ego, didn't have broad experience, but raised money and thought he did, right? And so I experienced this guy and I said, this is a disaster. I mean, there's no way that I'd work for this guy.
Right.
There's no integrity, meaning, you know, on one day you're doing well and the next day he would undercut you in a heartbeat. And what was interesting is over time, over the next 3 years, I came across people that had interviewed with this guy. And you know what was interesting? They came back with the exact same experience.
Right.
No difference. And what was interesting is this guy got bounced. They blew him out. They brought somebody else in because if you don't, I think if you don't manage from the right heart perspective, and it's all based in ego, and you are a sociopath and a bully, that word gets out really quick. And that's exactly what happened. People start talking. And oh, by the way, they miss some of their key milestones. They miss some of their key initiatives with the investors. And then you start, you know, the undermining starts to happen, right? Because as people experience that persona and they're deeply offended, what do they want to do? They want to sabotage. Even if this guy didn't give them a job, guess what they were doing behind the scenes? Sabotage by one word here, creating a perspective here. It's very, very damaging. And so I sometimes think that CEOs and high-level managers don't fully appreciate the impact of their words, the impact of their nonverbal communication, and the impact of their intention, because people see it. Once they can wake up from this fog of the bully and the sociopathic, you know, sort of approaches, once they can see it clearly, right? Go up to 30,000 feet and look down and say, aha, the great awakening, I see what's going on.
Right.
You know, therein lies the opportunity, but to those high-level managers, don't be fooled because people really know the skinny.
It's power. Power is not as attractive as it used to be in, let's say, the 80s and the 90s. You know what I mean? It's just different now. You have these millennials that are kind of taking over now. Right now, they're in their 30s and so on. What they found in research is that people are more inclined to work. They're willing to get paid less to work for something they believe in than get paid more to work for something they don't believe in. This is why if you look at businesses now, it's kind of the age of the founders, the startups. Hey, this is the person that started it, that created it, that founded it. Nobody really is like, who's the founder of the, you know, Bank of America? Nobody cares, right? Who founded Blockbuster? Nobody cares, right? But nowadays, the authenticity of the person, the story, the narrative of pulling yourself up, the narrative of being able to see something that others couldn't and push through, and the narrative of how great, Google's culture is. When you see, you know, when it first started, you're like, oh my gosh, it's a campus. It's not like a work office, you know, with you know, the blinds and the boxes. It's like, it looks like a playground. So as we move kind of into that space, it's becoming more difficult for these sociopaths, these egotistical leaders to be able to exist. It's becoming harder. And that's a great thing for the culture because it allows people are now able to voice themselves more than they ever have. People are now able to go after passion or purpose or find something that they believe in more than they ever have. My clients now, more so than even 5-10 years ago, are now at a place where they're like, I want to go somewhere that I believe in. Or when they're having an issue with their job, even though they love the people they work with, because of one manager that's driving them nuts, they're willing to leave. So people are becoming more clear on the importance of people. That's why, you know, human resources is now called people operations, because they're understanding that these are they're human resources, but it's about operating the people. It's about engaging the human experiences as opposed to seeing the human as a resource. I mean, think about that. Resource, human. It's a tool. It's a tool of the human for the business to make whatever end it's trying to make. But now you move to people operations. It's like, okay, how's the environment? How's the community? This is a shift in mindset that's really going to benefit all of us if we stay engaged and are able to separate ourselves from these toxic people.
Yeah, you know, the economy was cranking, so it gave people a lot more flexibility. And I like what you had to say, that people can identify what's going on and make decisions to leave, because I came across a study that talked about the prevalence of this sort of bullying psychopath sort of persona. And the study found that 1% of corporate psychopaths accounted for 35% of all bullying. In fact, under a corporate psychopath, as I'll term it, employees encountered bullying at 85 or 84 times the normal rate. So if you're working for this person directly, it is absolutely awful. And I think the link starts to explain why it's so pervasive within certain corporations. And again, as a percentage of the whole, the answer might be, since, again, sociopaths or psychopaths are 1% of the population, if we assume normal distribution, right, across the whole population, then we would see in every company why we have these kind of personas. And I think within human resources, as part, I know that if you look at Elon Musk, he has key questions he asks people that he's interviewing and bringing on board. I think there's an opportunity in that to really understand the psychology of somebody, the history of somebody, to make sure it fits that corporate culture. Because you're absolutely right. The CEO of a major like Elon Musk really sets the tone and the tenor, right?
Right.
And if you don't have that clear in your head, what is the culture, and you bring certain people in, it can be absolutely devastating.
Absolutely. It's the work that I do, I do advisorship for startups, and the first thing we focus on obviously is working on the founder to get their clarity of vision, because if their vision isn't articulated and clearly brought across, then there is not going to be a series A, B, or C. Second is creating that culture. How do you mimic the authenticity of the founder and create the culture that they want, and really digging and teasing out what's most important. What are the values of the organization? Because if you don't have clarity on who you are and who you are not, you will become a reaction to what is. If you don't have the protocol, it's like trying to build a house without the blueprint. You have to know kind of what to do in certain situations. And this is the work I'm doing currently. And the great thing about this cultural work is that it works in any business on the planet. Because if your people aren't right, your business isn't right. It's just as simple as that. And so a lot of times what we do is an organization, when we're working with organizations, and we're trying to figure out what are your values, and not like, break the status quo. It's like, no, what does it mean? How do you define it, right? If I say excellence is my value, the next thing I want to say is, well, first I got to play devil's advocate and push you to see if it really is your value. And let's say that we determine that, okay, excellence is very important to you. Then I'm like, what does it mean? Because excellence for one person can mean perfection, and for somebody else could be doing your best, right? And then so they're like, okay, excellence is if better is possible, good is not enough. And you're like, okay, great. So excellence, if better is possible, good is not enough. Now, I want you to describe behaviors on an individual level at your office that exhibit that, and then also behaviors at a team level that exhibit that. And then now what I want you to do is describe behaviors that don't exhibit that on an individual level, and behaviors that don't exhibit that on a team level. So what you're doing is you're creating this contrast, you're creating this clarity of what we are and what we aren't, and how it ties to the definition of excellence. So there's an entire soul, there's an entire narrative, so that when people are having their reviews, they're like, okay, where did we perform excellence? I can even review I can self-report, I can report my manager, do a report on them, and see if those values are being seen all the way across the continuum. Because if that's what's happening, if you have that accountability and everybody has bought in on these values, all of a sudden you can weed out immediately that bad apple, because they don't look like everybody else in terms of characteristics.
Boy, that is so critical, Berkey, what you just said. That's vital. And I think there's organizations that do 360-degree feedback, not only from the supervisor to the person they're supervising, but vice versa. And dimensionally across the teams,
Absolutely.
people can actually speak into the effectiveness of a given supervisor or boss. And so depending on the size of the organization and the resources, that can be very effective. But as I was doing some additional research, you say, well, why would psychopaths and bullies want to take on that behavior in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. And what I came across, this first one is predatory. They love to see people squirm. They like the power that goes with that. They like the reaction that goes with it. And then the second thing I've seen personally is they like to create smoke screens. They like to create so much drama within an organization. I remember I was with a startup where the CEO would just create fires everywhere. And everybody was just totally discombobulated. It was just chaos, thriving on chaos, literally. And they create that smoke screen. But here's the irony of it all. If you think about an organization, when the CEO is looking down and people are kind of wigging out and freaking out, who's the one person in that equation that appears to be stable, of sound mind, of sound reason? It's a sociopath. It's the bully. They actually are the ones that aren't reacting to it because they're creating it in the first place. So what you find happening in organizations is the CEO goes to the person that seems they can handle a lot of pressure and stress. And while the organization is feeling that ripple effect, these guys come off as sort of magnificent in the eyes of the CEO. Right. And again, if the CEO is not in tune with what's really going on, and you don't have HR that's really engaged, it's a very effective tactic for these psychopaths, sociopath bullies to get promoted in organizations.
Right. Right. This reminds me of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Caesar was walking in the palace and he saw Cassius, and Cassius was one of the people that were trying to create the conspiracy to kill Caesar. And this was before it happened. I think it was Caesar talking to Mark Antony, his good friend, and he sees Cassius in the distance and he goes, "He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous." And it really kind of reminds me of this psychopath that you're talking about, because in the chaos that's created by them, they're that eye of the storm, and so they seem as though they have everything under control, but
Exactly.
you only look as though you have everything under control because nothing's under control. And so what happens is this manipulation of space and time and belief with the gaslighting and all this different stuff, speaking into the ears of those in power, making relationships with those that have the ability. And I've seen it before, even I've seen it where organizations have raised up their friend, even though that friend is not good at their job, right? And so there's two ways to rise. One is through excellence and the other is through connection, which is dangerous. And so when you have this person, it's incumbent upon the upper level managers and the CEO and the founders, the C-suite, these people, it's incumbent upon them to make sure that their tent is clean, that they make sure that their structures are set in the beginning. And if they are not set in the beginning, they need to be reset. And that's work that I do. I do cultural resets, right? If that's not done, then their own ignorance will be their downfall, because that person isn't just coming to be at the second best, they're coming for the top, right? And it's not about whether they get it or not, it's about what destruction must be required in the process of it. If this is where you're at and they're coming for your seat, let's say they never even get to your seat, but you have to think about how much destruction is required just to get here. What is lost here, right? Not only are you losing profits, you're losing people. And when you lose people, most likely they're going to be telling other people about their experience, right? All of a sudden, Glassdoor is going to talk back about their experience at your work.
And that's why glass ceiling's so effective, right?
What's that?
Glass ceiling. People go to glass ceiling and see the real skinny on a given company. They can go there
right,
and get all the feedback and people's experience with that company and their leadership.
100%, man. That's where it speaks back. There's an equal opposite and equal reaction, right? There's always this is just the way of nature, right? And that's it's encouraging in a sense, is that at the end, nature always balances, it finds its equilibrium. You know what I mean? And so what's happening is the destruction caused is what creates the culture of resentment, which creates, it's not like every person who's going to be in that path of destruction is going to be mindful and understand, okay, 10% my fault, 90% theirs. No, you're going to create this path of people that are going to be angry at the organization. And they should be, because the organization is what was the environment that allowed this person to do what they did, right? So it's important, it's incumbent on leaders, man, in a huge way, to weed out even the top producing asses that exist.
Right. Well, it's funny when we think about this tactic, we think about Enron, and Enron had a culture of bullying, and we're talking, from their suppliers, their lawyers, their employees, the whole distribution chain. They had this culture of bullying to keep under sort of wraps what they were really doing. So it's very effective, right? And they were the biggest bust, the biggest, liars and cheats of all time from a corporate perspective. And they just destroyed a bunch of wealth for a lot of people. But they were known for a reputation of bullying and strong arming and threatening, no matter who was in that sort of that dynamic of the corporate experience. And it just goes to show you how effective it can be when used negatively, for sure. But anyway, it's interesting for sure. And I just think for the audience, it's important to recognize that there are psychopaths, there are bullies, there are people that are going to make your life miserable in the corporate arena. And next week, what I want to do is talk about some strategies and solutions to address it, identify it, and deal with it.
Absolutely, man. And I think it's one of these things, this is what people are experiencing. And it gets harder in a pandemic to be as choosy with what jobs you have, right? And so sometimes you're stuck in these places. And I've dealt with people who are literally absolutely stuck unless they get a $30,000 drop in salary somewhere else, right? And so for us to really work on, okay, how to spot them, what are the red flags, and also how do you make peace in the situation? Because if you can, there's ways to find how to maneuver and exist and not allow your internal self to be affected with these type of bosses to a certain extent, which will allow you to gain more connections. You know, one of my colleagues did research. His PhD was actually on, his dissertation was on work politics and how to maneuver through work politics to be able to get on top and avoid these psychopaths that we're talking about. So this is an important topic, and it's important for people to know that there are certain red flags of what to be aware of, but also to know that there's a way out. And it could be leaving, and it also could be some of the solutions maybe that we talk about next week. So this was great, man.
Absolutely, Burke. Hey, really enjoyed it. Enjoyed today's conversation. Until next time.
All right, man. Sounds good.
Thanks.